Live from the iLive studios in Toronto, Soothe My Soul presents Mars Venus with your host, Patrick O. Morris. Join the conversation now on our Twitter feed at Patrick Morris or in the chat room at www.ilivewebradio.com. And now, here's the man who is helping us find our path between the sexes, Patrick O. Morris.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Today, I've got a very special guest. This is Justin Toitier from the Canadian Association for Equality. I got to admit, today's topic is something that I've never actually addressed before, and many of you know that I've done a lot of discussions, a lot of workshops, but surprising to say, this is a topic I've never really touched on. I was hearing an interview with Justin on the radio, and the moment that I heard the interview, I thought definitely got to bring him on the show and have him just really talk about this particular topic. For those of you who may not know what the topic is, we're talking about why men often suffer in silence, and we're talking about domestic abuse towards men. So our society, we hear a lot about domestic abuse, and it's always pertaining to women. But the statistics, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but about 40% of domestic abuse is geared towards men. And we don't really hear a lot. If you take a look at my Twitter feed at Patrick O. Morris, I posted a video on there, and the video is kind of giving a scenario where in one scenario, the guy is very aggressive to the woman, and almost everybody steps in to break things up. But then they flip it, and then the woman's now, she's the aggressor towards the guy. And you see what happens. Nobody steps in. People are using their video cameras to record. People are laughing, but nobody actually steps in to diffuse the situation with the guy. So, Justin, I know your organization works a lot in this particular area. Maybe you can give us an overview of that.
Sure. We've been around now as an organization for a few years, but I think what's new has been our establishing the first facility in Toronto, which is a dedicated men's center. So it's a safe space for men to get the help that they need. It's certainly open to male victims of domestic abuse and violence and sexual assault, but it's broader than that. We also deal with depression, issues of suicide, fatherhood issues. We also support mentorship programs for boys who are sort of at risk of dropping out of school. So we do a real broad-based plethora of services and programs. But in the last few months, because there's been a lot of interest on domestic violence, largely around women, there's a Government of Ontario committee that's actually exploring this, as well as a billboard that our organization put out in downtown Toronto looking at the facts surrounding male victimization. This has attracted a lot of attention. That's why I was on that particular radio show. So we've been getting a lot of men contacting us looking for help as victims, and also a lot of women calling us because they know the reality of male victimization. They have sons, or they have brothers, or they have male friends who are victims, and very often men will not ask for help. Firstly, they won't get the help. Secondly, they're sometimes actually punished for speaking out. They may be mocked, as in the scenario you were just explaining. And sometimes actually, if a man calls the police because he's a victim of violence, he will actually be blamed as the perpetrator. He will be arrested. He will be jailed. Instead of being supported, he will actually be looked at as the guilty party. So there's a lot of reasons why men are socialized not to bother looking for help. By opening up our center, we're saying it's okay for men to be vulnerable, and we're offering a safe place where they can come to talk about their issues, hopefully to get the help that they need.
In our society, I think that when society looks at men, it doesn't really see men as vulnerable.
That's right.
The term, vulnerable generally pertains to women. Some of the men that do come through your organization that you do help and support, how do they deal with the stress of this? How do they handle the situation?
Well, I don't think there is a big difference in terms of the consequences on somebody's emotional well-being when they're a victim of violence, whether it's a man or a woman. What is different is that I think there is an added stigma, as you've suggested, for men to come forward terms like vulnerable or innocent are often exclusively used to refer to women, and then men have things like "take it like a man." I mean, there are expressions that have to do with men, but they're the kinds of expressions that sort of reinforce the stigmas rather than breaking them down. So for us, it's a public awareness campaign for the public to acknowledge the existence and the high degree of male victimization, and for men themselves to come forward and get the help that they need. Once they do come forward, I think then we have a really good opportunity to help them. We have programs like counseling and peer support that we're offering them, and we're also starting to create relationships with other organizations which have been around for a lot longer, because of the work that we've done and the work that other groups have been doing in this area. There are some large, credentialed, well-established, abuse-focused organizations that are largely, assisting women, but are open-minded enough to acknowledge that there are also men who need help, and they are looking to broaden their programs to help men. And we're very proud to be forming partnerships with those organizations so that we can address these issues, because we're a very small group. We're just getting off the ground. Alone, there's not much we can do. But if we can shift the narrative, if we can really open a conversation and create these partnerships, then we can really leverage our limited resources in a pretty big way.
You might know better. I'm sure you know better at this than I do. But across Canada, how many organizations are there that support men in this way?
Virtually none. There are, if we're talking about specifically for domestic abuse, we've done some research and we were unable to find any organizations or any shelters in Ontario, zero, that offer a dedicated space for men who are fleeing domestic abuse. Now, let's be clear, there are certainly homeless shelters for men, but there are dedicated shelters for women who are dealing with domestic violence. So it doesn't only offer women temporary residence, it also offers them therapy, counseling, employment resources, all sorts of ways to get them back on their feet after they've left a dangerous and abusive situation. It's not just shelters. There's also a plethora of other services that victims of violence need to sort of be rehabilitated, and move on with their life. There's zero things like that for men in Ontario. Across Canada, we were able to find one agency. It's in Winnipeg. It's called the Manitoba Men's Resource Center, and they offer 4 beds for men. 4 beds in all of Canada,
wow.
which is ridiculous. Now, of course, there are not enough beds for women either, but at least society acknowledges we need to do something for female victims of violence. There aren't enough spaces. Let's build more. When it comes to men, the statistics are dismissed. People just don't believe that the men are out there. And I can tell you from the hundreds of men who have contacted me personally, I know that they're there. I know that they're hurting. I know that they're not getting the help that they need. Why should it matter that they're men? Are we going to be open-minded and support all victims, or are we going to victim blame when the victims don't conform to our stereotypes?
Why do you think in a large country in today's modern era, like Canada, that there's 4 beds for men?
Well, partly it's that men themselves are far less likely than women to leave abusive relationships and get the help that they need. If they leave at all, they are more likely to deal with it themselves, to literally take it like a man, and to perhaps spend a few nights on a friend's couch and then look for their own apartment. They just kind of deal with it on their own, so they don't become a statistic, so people don't know that they exist. What's interesting is that when Statistics Canada does their decade-by-decade survey, and they ask questions about family violence, they do find similar rates of victimization among men or women, but in terms of actually going to the police, in terms of actually going to social service agencies to get help, virtually no men do that. So the men are there, we know that, but we also know they're not getting the help that they need. So when we ran our billboard ad, it wasn't only stating that half of domestic violence victims are men. That's been getting the most attention, but there was a second statement that people haven't really focused on as much, and that is the fact that 0 shelters are available to men. And that's just as shocking, that there are thousands and thousands of men out there, there's no place for them to go. And whether or not society cares about men or not, we should care about children. And the fact of the matter is, the innocent victims here are often children, because if a father has no place to go to leave an abusive relationship, what if he has children who are also in danger, and he has no place where he can go and take his children in order to escape that abusive situation? So we should be concerned about the well-being of this man, but we should also be concerned about the well-being of these children.
You had mentioned earlier that some of the men are reluctant to go and report this to the police because sometimes they become the ones who are kind of blamed
Yeah,
for the situation.
that's true.
Could you expand on that a little bit?
The police are actually given a set of instructions, and this comes from at the federal level. Actually, this has been prepared by the government of Canada, but it finds its way into instruction manuals at the provincial and municipal policing levels all across Canada. And what these manuals say, and we have one of these, the Toronto manual, on our website because it was unbelievable, so we wanted to put it up there. Is it actually tells police to approach domestic violence through a gender lens, which is basically profiling. So what they're told to do is when they get to a domestic, a situation where there's a domestic incident, where there's an allegation of domestic abuse, they are to apply a gender lens, and they are to separate the man and the woman, and they are to take the man out of the house, and they use gender language. It's always the man who's to be taken out of the house, and if necessary, he's to be detained, he's to be arrested, he's to be jailed, just for the sake of keeping the woman and the man apart. So even if it's the man who is got bruises on his face, even if it's the man who called the police to report that he's a victim of abuse, even if taking the man out of the house means that children are being left with a violent woman, all of that is immaterial. It's the man who has to be taken out of the house and, if necessary, put in jail so that the man and the woman, will be kept apart from each other.
So that's kind of scary.
It's crazy. And it's crazy that people don't know this is happening. But I can tell you, not just from the documents and the manuals, which provide a systematic approach to dealing with violence through this gender profile, as I describe it, but also from the hundreds of men who have come and said, yeah, that's been applied to me. I had the bruises. I had, photos showing all of these physical assaults that I had suffered. It didn't matter. They wouldn't even look at the photos. I had witnesses who saw that my wife had been the one assaulting me. They never contacted the witnesses, right? They just threw him into jail and awarded a restraining order against him to his partner. And in a couple of these cases, there were children, and that didn't matter either. The man was always looked at as the guilty party.
So in order to keep the man and woman apart so that the abuse does not happen, the guilty party is the one who's put in, the man, the guilty party, the person who's actually sustaining the abuse, that person is the one who's put in jail for a night or however long.
Yeah, and the logic is, it's critical to separate these two parties from each other. So we can work out the details of who's actually the victim and who's actually the perpetrator later. Let's just separate them. But the way that actually gets played out is that the man it's just simpler to always assume the man is the guilty party, even though we know that, it's roughly half who's actually guilty. In fact, most of the time, what we're talking about is mutual violence. Mm-hmm. Something like 60 to 70% of the time, these are just violent relationships where the man and the woman are violent against each other. But we don't, that's a more complicated way of looking at violence, even though it's the accurate way. It's more complicated, so we don't do that. We simplify things. We apply this gender binary: man bad, woman good. It's that simple to a lot of people. Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a break for a 2-minute break, and take some questions from line that there might be in regards to this particular topic. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about, in your experience, what is the impact to some of these men when they're the ones who are being re-victimized, and some of the ways in which your group, your organization, sort of helps them through that particular process. Because I can just imagine, I'm going to the police for help for a situation that's pretty bad, and then I'm the one who's kind of sitting behind bars. I'm the one who's who's being removed from the house, leaving my children behind. I'm worried about them. There's nothing really I can do about it. That's got a plague on their minds a little bit. And when we come back, we want to talk just a little bit about that in terms of your experience, and take some questions as well.
The best internet radio station around, iLife Radio, the new social network. The internet's #1 on the World Wide Web. iLife Radio.
And we're back. And I'm back with Justin from the Canadian Association for Equality. Before the break, we were talking about some of the men who are basically removed from the situation, they're the ones who are being treated as the aggressor when they're not. And how does your organization sort of help through that? I don't know, transition, or help them to be able to, what type of support is there out there for them?
Well, it is a kind of re-victimization. I think you're correct to use that language. We've had men who, because of the entire experience that they've had, both being victims of physical or emotional abuse and then the way they were treated by police, have ended up suffering from PTSD. And what they've told me is the way society, the police, their community, their supposed friends reacted to them coming out as a male victim of abuse was actually more of a contributing factor to the PTSD and the anxiety that they ended up suffering than actually the original abuse. So if we change our perceptions and if we change our response to these victims, we can actually do a lot to degrade the kind of suffering that they experience. Mm-hmm. We can't maybe stop the initial assault that they're suffering, although I think there are some things we can do there as well. I think a lot of the way we treat violence, we look at it through a gender lens instead of looking at it as how can we provide tools and resources so people find better ways to deal with their anger and their frustration. But what we can really control is how we as a society respond to these men. And I think that's where education and public awareness and acceptance that there are male victims, all of that needs to be done. That's what our organization's committed to doing.
Why is this why did you get involved in this? Why is this something, that you're passionate about, that you wanted to address?
Well, I think it's important to be equal in terms of our interest in human rights abuses. And so when I've done other human rights work for other communities and other issues, but I kind of gravitate to issues that have a low profile, issues that are important, issues that can actually be life and death issues, as I think this one is in some cases, but issues where there just isn't a good deal of public awareness, and where I feel that I can make a difference by providing that kind of public acceptance of the issue. And I support women's rights. I support the work that the LGBT community is doing, among other social justice movements that I'm quite involved in, actually. But I think this is an area where there really is very little understanding, very few resources, and I felt like, therefore, I could make a larger difference.
You mentioned the women's movement.
Yeah.
When I was listening to the interview that you were on, and there seemed to be a lot of perception that because your organization was supporting men, then you were against women, or you were not supporting women.
Because that's the simple gender binary way that a lot of people look at these issues, right? Mm-hmm. You're either supporting men or you're supporting women. What about the women who are affected by these issues? What about the mothers, the daughters, the female friends of these men who are suffering? It also affects them too. Mm-hmm. What about, for example, and this is a true example, because we've had mothers and we've had grandmothers who have come to us in support of the men and the male loved ones in their life, because it's also affecting them. Mm-hmm. Because when these men are falsely accused as perpetrators of violence, and they are consequently not able to have a relationship with their children, it also affects their mother, the grandmother of these children. Mm-hmm. So these are complicated issues, and the man who's falsely accused of being a perpetrator, even when he's actually the victim, if the result is that his relationship with his children is compromised, then so is that relationship between those children and the other women in his life. So these family issues are very important to these women, and that's why they often come looking for support for these male loved ones. And so we're very open and welcoming to whomever walks through the door, whether it's a man or a woman. And not only in terms of the clients that come to us, but also the facilitators, the individuals that provide the programs and services are both men and women, right? We probably have more women facilitating our therapy and our counseling programs than men. We also do some work on campus. We have some men's health groups on campus. Some of those groups are actually run by female students. So this simple idea that ours is a men's group, it's run exclusively by men to the benefit of men, it's far more complicated than that. And in terms of ideology, we have none. We're not a men's rights group, we're not a feminist group, we're a men's health organization. We provide services to men who need it. and women who need it too, for that matter, who are affected by these issues. So we don't have ideology. We sort of shun those kinds of simplistic labels. We just want to help people make families stronger.
So why does there sometimes seem to be a negative perception, I don't know, from whether it's feminists or from women or from just people in general who kind of see your organization? I don't know, maybe is it that they feel threatened by your organization because you're highlighting an issue that has been sort of under the rug for so long? Or
Yeah, I think so. Anytime you're talking about a new issue, an issue that raises facts that are not accepted, then people feel threatened by that. And I think there's also an element of zero-sum game that's perceived by a lot of people, that if you are talking about or wanting to raise resources for men, then those resources will have to come from somewhere else, and that means we're going to have less resources for women, right? So like, if we're opening a shelter for abused men, that's one less shelter for abused women. And since women are the real victims, right, as a lot of people think, that is then an attack on women. Which I think is crazy. I think if you're opening up a shelter or you're providing resources for any individuals who are victims, then that's a good thing because you're helping individuals. And I don't look at it through this gender binary that says that only when you help individuals within a certain group are you doing something good.
Wow. It's been very enlightening so far. I do want to talk a little bit about I can never really say the word statistics that are out there in terms of men who are abused, and again, how the police sort of address those things, or maybe you could speak to that a little bit. I hear numbers, 35% or 40% of domestic abusive relationships are the men or the victim.
I think the exact figure is not what's important. I mean, Statistics Canada, I think, is the best figure to look at if you're going to play the numbers game, because that's the most comprehensive survey, right? The rest are like research reports, and there have been sociologists and social scientists who have done research on what's called intimate partner violence or sometimes family violence, and those tend to show the same range of statistics, but they're not necessarily as rigorous because they don't have as many people who they question to prepare the data. So that's why I refer to the Statistics Canada research, and what it shows is consistently, decade by decade, it's done every 10 years by the government, roughly half of domestic violence victims are men, roughly half are women. That hasn't changed much since the statistics have been compiled. There's been a slight decrease in female victimization, a slight increase in male victimization. So that's the direction that they're going in. But they have tended to be comparable numbers, since the data has been studied. And as I say, it's not just Statistics Canada; it's also independent researchers. Martin Fiebert, for example, he's an American sociologist who's done a lot of work looking at family violence, and his numbers are also suggestive that it's roughly half-half. But and what I tell people who don't believe that is, well, okay, let's say it's only a quarter, of victims are men, and we know it's at least a quarter. I mean, that's kind of the most conservative estimate.
Yeah.
That's still thousands and thousands and thousands of men, who are not getting the help that they need because there's zero places for them to go. And that number, zero, is something that nobody disputes, because that's pretty well established that there are no shelters. So thousands and thousands of men, whether 25% or 50%, and zero shelters. I mean, you just do the math on that alone. There's an obvious problem. And a lot of people try to make this about numbers. Like, if you can show that it's not 50%, it's actually 40 or 45%. Therefore, my argument loses all validity. My argument doesn't require that there will be 50% of men who are victims. It just requires that there will be lots and lots of them, and a complete disregard for their well-being. I think that's enough to show that we have a real problem.
Wow. Like I said, this conversation has definitely been very enlightening for myself, and I'm sure for a lot of the viewers. I remember a situation that I was in with a friend of mine who was the victim, and the police came and they did get removed from the home. And when the police came, the officer at the time just kind of looked at him and said, I know that you're not the aggressor here. We can see that she's the aggressor, but you do have to leave. So,
Very typical, unfortunately.
unfortunately. And then he had to go to court because charges were laid against him. And so his lawyer had said to him, you can, if you go to the police station that's closest to your home and ask them to escort you to the house so you can get some of your clothes, because all his clothes were still there. They could go with you. You can get some of your clothes, and then, you're good. So I actually went with him to the police station, and it really blew my mind as to what that whole interaction was like. He's a fairly big guy, much bigger guy than I am. And when we went there, the officer behind the counter just looked at him and says, well, you're a big guy. You can handle yourself. You don't need us to come. And my friend looked at him and said, so are you telling me that I should do whatever I need to do in order to get my clothes? And the officer kind of looked at him and said, no, that's not what I'm saying. He says, well, what exactly are you saying?
Yeah.
I'm here because this is a serious matter. And the police officer was kind of joking in and around it. When I experienced that with my friend, I kind of looked at him and I was like, wow, like, how, I don't understand that. And his response to me was, well, you just got to do what you could do. And with hearing what you're talking about today and seeing that that's the reality for so many men, it would seem, that's very frightening.
And I think it shows that in some ways we've really progressed a lot in terms of fighting sexist stereotypes, but in other ways we've had almost zero progress. I mean, the fact that he was a big guy, he was a big guy and he was a guy, he was a man. Therefore, he can't be hurt. Therefore, the system is supportive of him, because what happens if he does go to get his stuff and he's attacked and he defends himself and she's hurt? He's not going to be supported. He's going to be looked at as the aggressor. But yet the assumption is, again, because he's a guy, that scenario is not going to happen because the law is set up to support men. All of these stereotypes, which are to the disadvantage of men in these kinds of situations, in those cases we've really progressed very, very little, if at all. Men are still routinely mocked, as it sounds like your friend was to some extent, when they ask for police support because they're afraid that they're going to be hurt by a female partner. So very often, I'm asked about my position on feminism and whether am I not just like a misogynist who thinks that feminism has gone too far? Actually, I would say feminism hasn't gone nearly far enough. It was supposed to break down all sorts of sexist stereotypes, but it hasn't done anything to break down the stereotypes that impede men from getting the help that they need. It hasn't done anything to tell men it's okay to be victims and to be vulnerable and to come out as victims and look for the help that you need. That has not really been, a big part of the agenda for feminism, and I wish that it was.
We're going to take another quick break. When we come back, I just wanted to touch base a little bit on, there are a lot of stereotypes that are out there in regards to men in this particular situation. And I just want to talk a little bit about what your organization is doing to combat some of that. And again, support the men who are in that particular situation. So just going to take a short break.
The best internet radio station around. iLife Radio, the new social network. The internet's #1 on the World Wide Web. iLife Radio.
And we're back. So your organization it sounds very much like you're at the forefront of this. You're somewhat pioneering a lot of, the support that didn't exist before. And along the process, you're, I guess, combating a lot of the stereotypes that are out there. And a lot of the stereotypes that all men really are kind of faced with. So how does your organization support those men, and what is the process that you go through to bring some knowledge forth to everybody?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's sort of a combination of two big thrusts. The first, which is more long-term, is to break down social stereotypes which impede men from getting help. And that is targeted both at society, which still harbors these stereotypes, but it's also targeted at men themselves, right? Breaking down the notion that men have, that they're socialized to accept, that they should take it like a man, that they should work these things out for themselves, that it's not okay to be vulnerable. So that's a big project. That's going to take a long time. The other is the more immediate thrust, which is providing programs and services to individual men who have been victims of violence, who have been affected by a biased legal system, especially in areas like family court or in areas that have to do with domestic allegations of domestic abuse. So we provide, services that deal with those immediate needs. We have like a legal aid clinic that's dedicated to men, because there are a number that are dedicated to women. But actually, some government-funded legal aid clinics won't support men. So if you're a man who can't afford a lawyer, you have far fewer opportunities to access justice than women have. So we're trying to do something about that imbalance. We offer a legal aid clinic. We also have peer support so that men can get together in groups and talk about issues that sometimes it's hard for men to open up about. So we gear ourselves to deal with those challenges. We have one-on-one therapy. We have employment assistance, mentorship, a whole plethora of services that are geared at different areas that are of particular concern for men, where men are finding it especially difficult to get the help that they need, either because it's not out there in society already, or because there are barriers specifically for men to look for those particular programs. So it's kind of those two different approaches that we take.
Where's your organization located?
The Center for Men and Families, where the programs are provided, is downtown at Carleton and Jarvis, Toronto.
Okay. And how do people get in touch with you?
They can go to the website for the facility. It's menandfamilies.org, or they can go to the website for the Canadian Association for Equality, which does the public education programs, the public awareness programs that we were talking about, which is equalitycanada.com, either website.
Okay. Now, you had mentioned that you're in the process of moving, and you're going to be offering some new programs?
No, we just moved in.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So that Center for Men and Families, our organization has been around for a few years, but largely doing public events and public policy campaigns and more on the long-term awareness side of things.
Okay.
The idea of providing services to those who immediately need help, that's the newer thrust.
Okay.
That's something we just started late last year and really ramped up our programs just in the last few months. So now we're offering like weekly peer support, weekly legal aid, and we're going to be introducing a fathering program as well in the next couple of months.
So if you're a man right now that's currently in an abusive relationship, what should he do?
You should contact the police. You should, well, I guess you contact us first, because we can probably give you some advice about how to contact the police. But we can't distance ourselves from the social programs that exist right now. So I'm not advising people when they're dealing with violence not to go to the police. I'm not advising them not to go to the hospital. I'm not advising them not to use Toronto's excellent social service agencies. But to be fair, those institutions are really not geared to be sympathetic to men. So I think first step is contact us. We can give you some advice so that you can navigate all of these institutions in a way that will help you, will help your children, will help your family. And you can give us a call at 647-479-9611. Again, the website menandfamilies.org, which describes all of the programs and has our contact information. And we can be a source of advice, of feedback. We can sort of help you and guide you through whatever process that you have to deal with.
So if you are a man and you are in this situation, and since there are no beds in Toronto.
That one's a lot harder. Now, the good news is we're working with some existing shelters to open up some beds for male victims of violence. As I said earlier, there are homeless shelters, there are violent shelters, domestic violence shelters for women. The one thing that's lacking is specifically a shelter for an abused man. So what we're trying to do is work with existing agencies and existing shelters to create a space, carve out a space specifically geared for men in that particular situation. That doesn't exist right now. It's something that we're working on. But for now, getting in touch with us so that we can sort of know who needs this service, that'll actually help us at this stage that we're actually building these new institutions.
What can the rest of us do from a political standpoint in order to help to bring some awareness and get the politicians involved in in focusing on this, because obviously it's a big issue.
Yeah, and as difficult as it is, and you will be up against stereotypes that will impede your progress, will make it difficult for you to be taken seriously. You still have to try. So right now, there's actually an opportunity because the Ontario government is looking at issues of violence and sexual harassment, and our organization has presented to this committee a couple of times. The committee is still traveling Ontario, meeting with men and women who have themselves been victims and listening to their stories. So definitely get an audience with that committee. That's something that you can do right now because the committee is meeting, but only for the next couple of months. But beyond that, putting pressure on elected officials is always a good idea. Letting them know that you are somebody who has been affected by the lack of social services for men, but do it in a polite way. Do it in a fair and balanced way. Don't exaggerate your situation. Just be honest. But if enough people are honest about their situation, I think that will make a difference. And also going to the existing social service agencies, going to the domestic violence shelters that are out there that are geared not for men but just for women, and telling them, I'm a male victim of domestic violence, would you accept me? And if enough men do that, maybe the story will get out that there does need to be a new space opened up for these men.
It's a lot to take on.
Any one of those things would be helpful, though. You don't need to do them all, but anything people do, it will, and as my theme was, it will add up over time, and I think make a difference.
For some of these men who you've worked with, who are in that situation, a lot of times they choose not to say anything.
Mm-hmm.
They choose to stay in the relationship, I guess, hoping that things would change, things would get better. Abusive relationships, are a challenge in itself, and just being able to walk away is a challenge.
Especially if you've got children in that relationship.
Exactly, if you've got children, and there's so little support that's out there for you.
Yeah.
With the conversations with some of these men that you've talked to, how have they been able to manage or to cope with that?
Well, it's obviously it's not easy, and some of them have been luckier than others, where they've had support structures from family or friends. But I think not speaking up it's really frankly the worst thing to do, because it's not good for you as an individual suffering, and it's not good for the larger cause and the social changes that we're trying to make, for people to stay quiet about this. It doesn't help us to make the case that these men exist if the men themselves are not willing to come forward and talk about their issues. So I have complete sympathy for how difficult that can be. Believe me, I've talked to enough of these men to know the challenges, but I'm also quite gratified and heartened by how many men are actually willing, and once you get them talking, quite enthusiastic to talk about their stories, because nobody's really offered them that chance before. Usually they're told to keep quiet, or they're mocked, or they're ridiculed when they try to speak up. In some cases, our organization's really the first opportunity they've had, without judgment, to talk as long as they want about what they've been through. And so one of the new projects that we've launched is exactly that. It's putting a camera in front of these men and giving them the opportunity to talk for as little or as long as they want, not coaching them, not exaggerating anything, just letting them tell their story. And if if they give us permission, we put it online, because that's how you break stigma, is you show that these people exist. Nobody thinks that there are male victims of violence. So what we do is we put a camera in front of a victim, and they talk about how it was that they ended up in an abusive relationship. And some of these guys are like your friend, they're big, perhaps macho guys. So the stereotype is, they're certainly not going to be a victim, and yet here they are opening up about what they've gone through. And I think that over time will make a real difference.
We haven't really sort of touched on it a little bit, but we haven't really talked a lot about the children.
Yeah.
Who kind of get caught up into this, and I know there are some numbers on children who witness abuse.
Mm-hmm.
They themselves down the road becoming abusers, but with the experience that you've gone through, a lot of these men who are fathers, who are trying to protect their kids, look after their kids. What are some of the experiences that they've expressed towards you in regards to that?
Yeah, and that cycle of violence is certainly something I think we should all be committed to breaking. whether the cycle is fueled by a mother or by a father. It shouldn't matter. Our ultimate concern should be that we break that cycle so we don't have the next generation being as violent as the generation that raised them. This, and a lot of people sort of forget that men stay in abusive relationships often for the same reason that women do, and that is to protect their children. That's sort of another stereotype, is that men, even if they are victims, well, they can just get out of a relationship scot-free, but actually they can't because they often have kids. It's the same reason women often go back to an abusive home. It's because they want to protect their children. And so a lot of men that come forward to us, what I've really been again heartened to see is how much they put the well-being of their children front and center, whether it's getting those children out of an abusive situation, or whether it's fighting to maintain a relationship with their children after a family has broken down. One of the new programs we're going to be offering, this fathering program that I mentioned a couple of times, it's specifically geared at fathering after separation or divorce, to make sure that whatever happens between a father and a mother, that it doesn't spill over, it doesn't create these dangerous cycles that create instability and violence in the next generation. So this particular program will be for fathers who want to maintain an active and healthy relationship with their children after, unfortunately, a family relationship is broken down between the mother and the father.
The navigating the court system is
well, that's a whole other episode, I think.
is a bit of a challenge,
yeah.
And as a guy who's kind of re-victimized, now you're painted with this brush, that you're the aggressor,
Yeah.
and you're heading to court now just because you want to be able to see your children. How do you support the guys? Is there any support for that sort of thing, being able to navigate what that court system looks like?
Yeah, that's a huge issue for us, which we've only tangentially touched on, but it's actually what motivates a lot of people in our organization to become volunteers and to get actively involved, is that they've gone through family court. Mm-hmm. And once you come out of family court, you see the world in a very different way, especially if you're a man, because sort of all bets are off what can happen to you in the family law system, especially here in Ontario. So so I mentioned a couple of programs, the legal aid and the peer support, mm-hmm. and those programs aren't geared at any particular issue. So we do have a lot of men that come to legal aid because they're dealing with family court issues, and they want to have some guidance as they go through that process. And the legal aid is run by a couple of lawyers with an expertise actually in family law, because
Okay.
that's probably the biggest issue for which men are seeking our legal support. And then the peer support that we offer, again, that's also very open. So it does deal with men who are coming for support because they've been dealing with employment issues, or they're dealing with as we were talking about earlier, dealing with victimization of one kind or another. But again, probably the biggest reason people come to the peer support is they're finding it very difficult to maintain a relationship with their children after a family breakup. And this is where parental alienation is often something we hear a lot about. And these men are looking for learning from other men who have been through similar situations, and they want to know what resources and tools are out there so that they can maintain a relationship with their child.
Great. We're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we do have a question online, and the question is being asked, how can we help? How can we help your organization? How can we, help with driving this agenda?
Sure.
So we're going to talk a little bit about that when we come back from break, because I would like to find out really, how can we help?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Happy to share that.
The internet's #1 on the World Wide Web. iLive Radio. The best internet radio station around. iLive Radio, the new social network.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So, and again, I'm sitting here with Justin, the executive director with Canadian Association for Equality. So yeah, one of the questions that has come up online is, how do we help? What can we do to help your organization? I guess to bring some awareness to this. Like, what can we do?
Well, the organization is almost entirely volunteer run, so we rely on volunteer support. So if somebody's interested in getting involved as a volunteer, there's lots of things to do. We'll find something that meets your skills, your interest, your experiences, etc. But I think the biggest thing we need is, as I suggested earlier, is to tell these stories. And it's not just violence, it's not just issues to deal with family courts. Lots of men have unique experiences that are of interest to us, that deal with systematic issues that we're looking to address, and that deal with bigger issues, bigger cultural patterns, which we don't always understand the full picture when we're only looking at women's stories, right? And so we should also be looking at men's stories, and getting men in front of a camera and telling those stories is one way to advance our understanding of a whole bunch of social justice issues. So if it's a man who's looking to raise awareness and he has a story to tell, and he's willing to speak out publicly, then we will provide a facility for him to do that. And that's a real, tangible way that somebody can contribute to this larger movement.
So in terms of the volunteer, that you, volunteer help that you can utilize, men, women,
everybody.
Everybody.
As I said earlier, we have women who are providing a number of the social services that we do, that they're facilitating those. We have women involved at every level of our organization, from the board of directors down to, every committee that we run, and some of our campus groups are being run by female students. So this is very inclusive. This is a very inclusive organization. The one thing everybody is connected by is that they have a care for the health and well-being of men and boys. And you can be gay or straight, you can be a man or woman, you can be of any ethnic or racial background. That is the only thing that is required of you, is that you genuinely want to improve the health and welfare of boys and men and their families.
So it doesn't matter what your expertise might be.
Oh no. There's lots of things to do. Manual labor. There's providing services. There's sort of administrative work that we need. So if you're willing to put some time into this, we'll certainly find some way to make that contribution meaningful.
Okay. I guess one thing we didn't really touch on, but you touched on a little bit, and that is, the same-sex relationships, where men are might be in an abusive situation with that. How does your organization handle those situations?
Well, that's something we've been talking a lot about as well in the context of victimization, because and again, to go back to this Ontario Sexual Violence and Harassment Committee that's been meeting for the last few months, the way that was framed initially was it was only looking at one story of violence, one scenario, which was male-on-female violence, which is an important story, and we need to do more to support female victims of male violence. But it's not the only story. So we've been talking a lot about male victims, but when we presented to the committee, we also talked a lot about female victims of female-perpetrated violence. Children who had been abused sexually by their mother when they were younger. We don't want to hear about that, but that's a story too. The other story is, of course, violence in same-sex relationships. And study after study shows that is just as prevalent as violence in opposite-sex relationships. So violence knows, it knows no socioeconomic status, it knows no ethnicity, it knows no age, it spans all of these different demographic considerations, but it also spans all genders and all sexual orientations. And that's been a contribution we've been trying to make to public policy deliberations with respect to dealing with violence.
How long has your organization been around?
3 years. The Canadian Association for Equality has, and we became a charity just about a year ago, and a little over a year ago now, and we've opened our office, our men's center, just in the last 6 to 8 months.
So you're a charity, so aside from volunteering your time, people can also choose to donate?
Absolutely, of course, we welcome that. In fact, we are almost entirely funded by private donations. On top of private donations, we get a few grants from philanthropic foundations, but we get absolutely zero from the government.
Really?
We're hoping to change that, but we do acknowledge that we sort of need to show proof of concept because we are a new organization. Before the government's going to grant us funding, it's important that we show what we can do. And so to do that, we've had to rely on private donations, but we've had hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands now of individual donors, whether small donations or large donations, and every little bit helps.
So the non-funding from the government side, is that due to like the fact that this is not on the radar for the government, or?
It's due, we did a lot of research when we started our operations, and what we found was that there were very few men's health and men's center agencies in Canada, but the few that were there got very little money from the government. They spent most of their time competing for government grants and were not very successful. So we took a different angle. We realized if this was going to work, it would have to be grown first using private donations. And then once we were able to use those private contributions to put some programs together to show what we could do, then we'd have a track record, and then it would be a little bit easier to compete for government grants. So we are going to be looking at getting government support. I mean, after all, there are community service grants, there are grants that support women's domestic violence shelters. All of those should be open to this, funding the services that we provide. But we knew going into this that this was going to be controversial, that there was an element of novelty to it, and that governments are the most risk averse of any element in society. So we knew that they would be actually the hardest donor to attract, and that it wouldn't make sense to start there strategically, but we will be getting there.
You'd think it would be a no-brainer considering,
But you'd think people would care about male victims of violence.
Exactly.
You'd think people would care about equality in family courts, and that's just not the way we're not quite there yet.
Okay. There was another question online, and that is, what advice can you give a mother or a father who wants to, I guess, protect their sons, to help them to not become a victim in situations like this?
Yeah, really good question. And we do have a lot of parents that are reaching out to us, but often it's after their sons have been victimized. Actually, we had a really heart-wrenching story from a grandmother, and she had a son who was in multiple relationships where he was a victim, not just physically, but emotionally, and he was denied access to his child. And the reason why she was coming to us instead of him was that he was just so depressed by what he had gone through that he couldn't get out of bed, never mind come and get help from us. And she was worried that as a grandmother, she would lose access to her grandson because the mother of the child was preventing both the father and everybody in his side of the family from seeing his child. So that's an example of how these are not just men's issues. These affect everybody. I think what's important for these parents to do is to understand what they're up against, to understand the way in which the system is sort of set up, not against men, but that's the way it sort of ends up being, because they just don't take men's issues seriously or male victimization seriously, and the result is that men have very few places to go. But I think coming from especially a mother, that can make a difference. A mother is sort of given more of the benefit of the doubt, unfortunately, than her son even is. So, if unfortunately the son is in a situation of violence, for the mother to be the one to go to the police, especially if she has witnessed this kind of violence, the way we're at right now, sorry to say, she's probably more likely to be taken seriously than the victim himself, than her son is. So there's a real role that mothers can play, and that's why a lot of mothers have been coming to our facility looking for help. And it's really great to see that they are so loving and caring and, willing to sacrifice, their own well-being in some cases for the sake of their son and of their larger family.
Wow. Clearly, this is a huge issue that we're not going to solve on this show.
No.
But, I do appreciate you being here and bringing some well-needed awareness on this particular topic, because it's a very large issue that's been kind of kept under the rug for a long time. There are a lot of people who never really think about it. In society, a lot of times we just kind of make fun of it. But the thing I would say is I would encourage everybody, if you do end up in a situation that you do see any situations where anyone, male or female, is being abused by someone, that somebody would step in And, it wouldn't be a matter of if it's a woman, so I need to protect her, but it'd be a person, male or female.
We should look at these as individuals and not just which gender are they. And then once we know that, we know the entire story. People are more complicated than that. And I think it's the same, it's the same advice that I think worked quite well in the early days of the feminist movement, where violence against women was often looked at as a private matter. Domestic violence against women was looked at as a private matter. And then the stigma there was broken by people saying that if you were aware of a woman who was being hurt by a male partner, you had a duty to speak out, right? That if you stayed quiet, that you were in a way supporting that violence, right? And the same thing in the LGBT community, that if you witnessed gay bullying, you had a duty to speak out. Well, there's no difference here. Just because it's a male victim, it's still an innocent individual who's suffering. And if you know that that's happening, then you have a duty to speak out. You certainly don't have a duty to mock and ridicule.
Wow. For those who are online, thank you guys for joining on the show. I definitely, encourage you to check out the website. What's the website again?
So it's equalitycanada.com and menandfamilies.org.
Okay. And if you are a man who is in need of any of these services, by all means, reach out to Justin and get some help.
For sure.
There may not be a lot of services that are out there to support you, but there are some.
Yep.
And Justin's group will definitely be able to connect you. The Men and Fathers program that you're talking about, that sounds like something that would definitely be valuable, whether or not you are a victim of domestic violence or not. It definitely sounds like it'd be a good place for men to go with their sons. As well, if you want to reach out to Justin's organization and donate, whether it's your time or your resources or your funds, definitely do reach out to their group and provide some assistance, because it is a worthy cause. Again, you mentioned, reaching out to our elected officials and notifying them that this is a topic that really requires some attention.
And again, I want to stress doing it in a respectful way.
Way.
Because a lot of people are angry and frustrated, and that's okay. I mean, being angry and frustrated is a fair response, whenever you see injustice, but you really have to know how to channel that towards a positive end. And that means, putting your anger and frustration to the side and presenting a coherent and well-articulated argument for change.
Now, you had mentioned that the videos that, men are able to come to your location and record a video,
absolutely.
Talk about their experience, just to get the awareness out there. By all means, if you want to do that, you can. If you want to post the video, you can connect it to my Twitter feed. It's Patrick O'Morris, and
Perfect.
You're on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter. Well, so we have Equality Canada. That's our Twitter feed for the Association for Equality. And then if you're tweeting about the programs that we provide, or if you need help, for example, from that you think some of our services can help you with, that would be at Men and Families.
Okay. So if they were to post, have a video that they created of themselves talking about their experience, they could post that.
At Men and Families. And we also have a Twitter hashtag called Let's Talk Men, which we're using as part of our billboard campaign to spread awareness about domestic violence, about family court and parental alienation, about male suicide, about a whole bunch of men's issues. It's hashtag Let's Talk Men.
Great. Any final comments to the viewers out there?
No, just that I'm very glad for their interest in this, and I'm really pleased to see that it is becoming something we're more and more comfortable talking about. That's the way it's going to have to start.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on the show. I will hear you next week. Take care.
Thank you.
The best internet radio station around. I Life